Welcome to the new Rules for Negotiating 10-Minute Learning Series, a short but comprehensive series of contract negotiation webinars specifically designed for people who negotiate complex customer-supplier agreements. This year's lessons are based on my training manual, The Contract Professional's Playbook. You will love this year's learning lessons. I've written the Contract Professional's Playbook. This playbook covers critical topics for contract administrators, negotiators, and contract managers. The playbook and these learning lessons focus on the connection between contract terms and conditions and contract management throughout the three phases of the contract life cycle: pre-award, award, and post-award. I look forward to introducing these topics to you, and if you'd like me to bring this playbook to your organization, just let me know. Let's talk change in the form of scope changes. Changes in scope can be minor, like a change in a delivery date. Usually when we talk about scope changes, we're talking about increasing a portion of the work, and that corresponding scope change increase will also increase the price to perform the work. We often don't talk about what happens when we want to decrease a scope of work in a fixed fee or lump sum agreement. So I'll give you some best practices on that as well. 3 best practices. Your goal is to effectively modify the scope of work to meet your organization's goals, which will include both completing the project and staying within budget, or at least being cost conscious. Now, some organizations focus too much on completing the project with not as much emphasis on the cost part to the buying organization or the amount that the supplier will have to charge in order to complete that project. In some organizations, there's too much consciousness around cost. How much is this going to cost? The supplier is saying it's going to cost a certain amount, and the buying organization claiming that that's quote unquote too much, without enough emphasis on being able to complete the project. So as a contract professional, your goal whenever talking about scope changes, whether you're the supplier or the buyer, is to manage both completing the project and staying within budget or being cost conscious. The key to your success is to avoid modifying a contract for foreseeable and avoidable changes that could have been included in the scope of work. Now, this is a two-way street. Both the buying organization and the supplier's organization bear responsibility for a complete scope of work. There are always things that the buying organization knows about what it wants or expects that the supplier's organization doesn't know, and vice versa. The supplier knows things about how the work should be performed that the buying organization does not know. In a commercial setting, be sure to develop a comprehensive scope of work before the contract is finalized and the supplier begins work. In a governmental setting, this is a little more challenging as you have to be responsive to the solicitation in your bid. So there's almost more emphasis on the supplier to be comprehensive in their statement of work that's included in a responsive bid. Let's focus on an area that few people talk about: decreasing a scope of work mid-project. Decreasing a scope of work can happen for many reasons, ranging from a change in the business direction to a divestiture of part of the business to a change in the economy. Without a good baseline, both the customer and the supplier can struggle to reduce the scope in a way that preserves the essential nature of the project and that accurately reflects the reduction in cost. So for example, a client of mine knew after the supplier was awarded a $90 million project, but before the contract negotiations began, that the scope of work would be reduced over time. part of the buying organization's business unit was closing over time. That closure directly impacted the scope of work at the end of the project's life. Unfortunately, the negotiation team, including myself, learned of this from the news, so my client, the buyer, included complex provisions giving them the right to decrease the scope of work. We included the notice, the process for working the scope change through the amendment cycle, etc. What we could not and did not adequately anticipate was how in a lump sum contract of this magnitude and spanning a couple of years was to calculate the credit from the reduced scope. Did we calculate that number and suggest it as a starting point negotiations, or did the supplier? And how were we going to validate the credit? These are questions I wish we would have included in the contract language. So, as a practice note for you, here are 3 tips. 1. When decreasing the scope of work, include the party who will calculate the credit to the buying organization. Put that in the contract. 2. Ensure that the other party can validate the credit with data. So put that in the contract too. And 3, have a dispute resolution process just in case one party disagrees with the other party. And by this I mean, like within the scope change work, how would the party receiving the financial data have a process if they felt that that data was inaccurate, too high, too low, whatever the case may be. Now, I want to take a moment to note for suppliers to the government. There's a couple things about scope changes that I think are really important. Slow down. So federal, state, and municipal contracts are a little bit different and sometimes a lot different than commercial contracts. Please be very clear in your bid response. They are often, if not always, restrictions surrounding the bid in the form of the competitive solicitation laws, meaning some laws restrict governmental agencies from increasing the scope of a project and/or increasing the total fee for a lump sum fixed fee and time materials contract. I've worked on several governmental contracts, pre and post award. Here's my advice. 1. Write your proposal scope of work in a very detailed manner. Many of the government solicitations I've seen are really lacking in critical details in the scope of work. In fact, some are a mess, in my opinion, really confusing to the supplier pool, leading to these wildly varying amounts to perform the work. These inadequate scopes of work in the solicitation package leads to a misunderstanding that often places the supplier between a rock and a hard place. The government contract manager assumes certain work is covered at no increase in the fee. This is partially correct. The fee usually cannot be increased. If the scope of work is unclear, suppliers could end up doing more work than anticipated when bidding on the work without earning more money on the project. 2. Document, document, document. Note all the changes to the government contract manager that he or she asks for and put them in one place on your end to be able to track them. Small things like a change in date may be no big deal, or it could be a really big deal, jeopardizing your project's overall timeline. Assume the government contract manager is not keeping track of the changes he or she is asking for. And 3, keep a log of lessons learned for the team that puts proposals together. That way the account management team and the sales team can properly bid on government work. Want to learn more about the Contract Professionals Playbook? Then email me. I'd be happy to talk to you and your team member about how to bring the playbook into your organization.